Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Protests against gender identity education in schools are taking place across the country today, and they're facing counter-protests supporting SOGI. We'll discuss what is in the SOGI curriculum, and we're asking you what are the conversations you have or want to have with your child about gender identity and LGBTQ plus rights. After 12:30, it is Alzheimer's Awareness Month. How can we empower people living with dementia? I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Welcome to you. Well, protests against schools teaching children about gender and sexual diversity are taking place across BC and other provinces as well today. Posters created by a group called 1 Million March for Children say participants are, quote, standing together against gender ideology in schools. Here in BC, that refers to the SOGI, or Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Program. There are counter rallies planned today as well. BC Premier David Eby posted a letter on social media denouncing hate toward LGBTQ communities. And BC Human Rights Commissioner Kasari Govender issued a statement saying peaceful demonstration protects democracy and generates debate, but the human rights of the trans and LGBTQ community, quote, is not up for debate. We're going to touch down in the communities of Kamloops and Vancouver this half hour. We'll also speak with an SFU professor and the author of the book, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. We're also taking your calls. If you're a parent or an educator, what are the conversations you are having or want to have with children about gender identity and LGBTQ plus rights and issues? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. First, let's head to Kamloops, and CBC reporter Marcella Bernardo joins me now. Hi, Marcella. Good afternoon.
Hi, Michelle.
I see you're back in the Kamloops Bureau now. Where were you this morning?
Well, around 9 a.m. is when the two groups started to gather outside the courthouse in downtown Kamloops. And initially, this was billed as a rally by the group that was organizing the 1 Million March for Children. But when I got there, I noticed that they were very heavily outnumbered by people who are pro the SOGI program, which what you mentioned was the sexual orientation and gender identity resources that are taught in schools in BC. So very large crowd was there cheering that are supporting these programs, and they were the people that were there initially to protest them, maybe 20 to 25 people, were heavily outnumbered by at least 20 to 1.
Okay. And you spoke with some of the people there at both rallies. What did you hear?
Well, mainly the people that were willing to speak to me were those that were trying to outnumber the demonstrators. So they're very concerned about misinformation out there about these programs that are in schools that are basically to try to educate people about trans and LGBTQ community. And so I spoke to a reverend from the local United Church. I spoke with a lawyer who has been very vocal about his own kids being in learning these resources. And I spoke with Kamloops City Councillor Nancy Beppel, who was also there as the only member of City Council who's still in Kamloops because everybody else is attending the UBCM. And on the other side, the people that were organizing this rally, I found it very difficult to have conversations with them because they all seem to think the media is there to attack them, and they didn't want to be interviewed. And so I had one really good conversation with a gentleman who didn't want to share his name, but he was there mainly to say he doesn't have hate for anybody. He's not there against children learning about these programs and these resources. He just thinks that it's up to the parents to decide how old the child should be before these resources are shared in schools. And so he was trying to make the point that he doesn't let his child drink beer when they're 5 years old. So it should be up to the parents to learn that. So I think there's a little bit of misinformation too about what is being taught in schools, because he was adamant that he wants to be the one that decides what his children are taught. But if you talk to the people who are behind these programs, the people that are the educators in schools, what they're saying is that parents have full say in them. So there seems to be a lot of confusion out there about what exactly SOGI is.
And we're going to talk more about SOGI with our guest in a few moments from now. How would you describe the atmosphere at these rallies as you visited them today?
Well, they were very loud. There was a lot of people chanting "No space for hate," and that was the echoed chant that was being heard over and over again as people were driving by and honking their horns in support for both sides. I'm assuming because you weren't sure who was standing on what side of the street. They were all kind of mixed together, and so the atmosphere was very peaceful. Although there was a police presence there just to make sure that everybody stayed that way. I witnessed a couple of shouting matches between. Somebody that I felt was just there just to be an instigator, that I don't feel like that person was actually part of the anti-SOGI demonstration. He was just somebody walking by that decided he was going to try to mix it up a bit, and he was quickly shouted down by the people who were there to support SOGI.
And you mentioned, Marcella, that you spoke with the lone Kamloops City Councillor who's not in Vancouver for UBCM. What did you hear from her?
Well, Nancy Beppel is definitely an ally for the LGBTQ and trans community in Kamloops. So she felt that it was very important for her to be there. She is the only councillor who's not at UBCM. There's many other people on city council, in fact, all the city council, who support these programs as well. I've talked to them about this in the past. And so she wanted to just make sure she was there to represent, and herself mainly as someone who is there. And she was very supportive of the fact that the crowd was outnumbered. It wasn't clear this morning how many people were going to show up for either side. And then once people showed up, you could see that they were surprised, or maybe not surprised, but that it was just that for her, it was something that she was happy to see, that there were more people there that support this kind of education in schools than don't.
Marcella, very good to have you today, and thank you for giving us a picture of what took place in Kamloops. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That is CBC reporter Marcella Bernardo joining us from our Kamloops Bureau. And we are asking you, if you're a parent or an educator, what are the conversations you are having or want to have with your child or students about gender identity and about LGBTQ plus rights and issues? Our phone number, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And you can hit pound 690 as well. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. Sunny is joining us from New Westminster. Hi, Sunny. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts today?
Well, frankly, I'm feeling pretty discouraged because I had thought of Canada as a refuge from this sort of vitriol and hate. I was living in the States when Trump came into power and started making plans to move back home to Canada pretty much immediately. It took a little while, but we got here, and it took a little while because COVID came up. And now here I am with my trans kids that I persuaded would be safer, and I don't feel they're that much safer here anymore. The rising vitriol and hate against not just trans people, but all the other people, all people who are different from somebody's idea of the mainstream, is on the rise. And it does, to me, very much reflect what's happened in the States. You really saw it come out with the convoy, how Americanized all that was. And I'm just seeing that more and more, and I'm just so gratified for everyone standing up against hate towards the trans community, towards any individual. It doesn't matter if you're different. It matters that you're loved.
Sunny, can you tell me about your family's experience? How is your child doing in school? What difference perhaps is the SOGI, the resources from the SOGI program making?
The resources from the program, well, I wouldn't say they've really had any impact that I'm aware of. In our personal lives. We arrived back to Canada during COVID, and my child went to Simon Fraser University for 2 years, and it was all online. So they really don't have the college experience. They left after 2 years of trying to do that.
Right.
They'll go back, but it has been, that's a COVID interruptive. So they haven't been, as much a part of society as they would have liked to be. But what we hear on the news and see on the news, it's frightening how much more like the States Canada has become in terms of intolerance and open racism and etc. Whereas the country I left, we didn't tolerate that kind of behavior. We're discouraged. When I lived in Canada 20 years ago, where I grew up, I lived for 40 years. Most open displays of racism and hatred were condemned at large. The civil rights movement had an impact. And now it's like it never happened. We're going back into the dark ages, slowly but surely, in our mentality. You really saw it come out with that trucker convoy. And now I have my trans kid back here in Canada, not feeling safer at all, feeling like it's just maybe a little ahead of a curve. That same vitriol is rising.
Right. How do you address that? What do you talk about in your family? How do you try and move forward, I guess?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of conversations are about how to survive it. You know, I've sent them to take CPR courses and that sort of thing to become more capable of survival in the face of adversity.
Why
has been a
CPR
large
courses?
part of it.
Why CPR? Why CPR courses?
Because anytime there's public gatherings about these sensitive issues now, there's usually injury. And my child is more inclined to be a helper than a protester. How can they help? They can help those who get hurt, basically. And so, you know, whatever it is that they can be a part of, they're not that assertive, you know. So in any way that they can be a part of surviving it all and helping others to survive it all seems to be where they fit in. But that's just, you know, an individual thing.
Yeah.
What we see out there isn't very welcoming. There are pockets, but society at large has become a little bit more, you know, in our eyes, Americanized.
What do you hope from leaders then? I quoted Premier David Eby in his letter that he posted on social media. What do you want to hear or see when it comes to action from leaders?
Well, I think legislating against any kind of education or any kind of knowledge is basically a bad idea. And it's no better an idea in this context. I'd like to see banning of information and books and anything along those lines to be legislated right out of Canada. It doesn't help to shove anything in the closet. Truth comes to the light, and that's it. There's no point in hiding anything. Why hide gender identities or even, you know, thoughts and feelings about gender identities from anybody? It doesn't even make sense. Whatever you shove in the closet is going to transform into something you don't want to know.
Sunny, I have to move on, but thank you very much for the powerful call. Really appreciate hearing from you.
No problem. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. That's Sunny joining us from New Westminster. This is BC Today here on CBC Radio 1, live streaming as well on CBC Gem and on our website, cbc.ca/BC. You can also use the CBC Gem app. In a few moments from now, we're going to speak with an SFU professor and author as well of the book, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, around what they're observing and thinking about today. First, we have a clip as well. In Prince George, David Lowe is the organizer of today's rally against SOGI education. Now, he told the CBC why he is against that program being taught in schools.
It's one thing to say, well, we have various people of different feelings about sexuality. It's a different thing to teach everybody that this is perfectly normal, and you, as a student, should look into that if it's applicable to you. No, my grandchildren should not look into that if it's applicable to them, because we of faith have a very strong opinions of morality.
Clint Johnston is president of the BC Teachers Federation, and he told CBC Radio that there's some misunderstanding about what children are being taught in SOGI programs.
You can go right to the SOGI website and see all of the materials. It's not really hard at all to get the information. You go into your school, like I said, and speak to somebody, and they're happy to engage with parents. We work with parents. to do the best we can to teach curriculum. So I think it's a lot of misunderstanding. It's people getting information from people they know or the internet, and then acting on that. And it would be good if people went and looked at the SOGI resources, talk to somebody, eliminate that fear. You know, we fear the unknown, understand and learn about what's really happening. The reality is that we're trying to teach a more realistic picture of the diversity of the students and the people that exist all around us, and to make sure that those individuals who for a long time haven't felt safe, that they do feel safe and included and represented, and know that their teachers and everyone in the school are there to support them in being their true selves.
And as we've been hearing, there are protests across BC today about schools including gender and sexual diversity in their curricula. Similar events have been happening across Canada, but critics say these protests are driven by misinformation. Earlier today, I spoke to a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University about what they say the protests are getting wrong. And here's my conversation with Travers. They are also trans non-binary and author of the book, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. Travers, welcome to the program.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me on.
Well, what are your thoughts on the protests that we're seeing in BC and across Canada today, specifically protesting the teaching of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Program, also known as SOGI?
Well, I'm deeply alarmed and not surprised. We've seen wave after wave of anti-LGBT organizing in the United States, and we know that conservative forces in Canada have a long history of opposing inclusive policy regarding queer and trans people. So I find it very alarming because it's so damaging, but I'm not surprised to see it.
And when you say it's based on misinformation, what do you think is the misinformation there that's driving these protests?
The assumption is that SOGI curriculum actually encourage kids to be queer or trans, and that they interfere with the influence of parents on kids. And one of the things that we know is that there have always been queer and trans kids, and there will always be queer and trans kids, but the extent to which they make themselves known depends on whether or not their environments are welcoming. And for kids whose family situations or home situations aren't safe places to be queer or trans, if they can find any space, and, you know, schools seem like an obvious place where they can get support and recognition, it will help them develop resilience. It will help them literally survive. So if you want good outcomes for children and young people, you need to make sure that queer and trans kids feel included and supported.
And I should say as well, for full disclosure, that I have a copy of your book. You sent me a copy of your book a couple of years ago. And when it comes to that revolution, you know, trans people have been historically underrepresented in media, in education, as you've been talking about. You know, what's changing there?
Well, starting in the 1990s, a very successful social movement of trans and gender variant people and medical and clinical practitioners who support us have been really successful in gaining some inclusion. You know, it's far from ideal. When I published my book in 2018, you know, I certainly noted that things were improving for trans kids, but that there's still a really long way to go because all our institutions remain binary organized. Trans kids bump into, you know, like sex segregated bathrooms and locker rooms, and just people's assumptions that there are only boys and only girls, and that what you are, you know, is really obvious from birth. So there has been some space made, but one of the things that I see with these really well-funded and damaging anti-queer and anti-trans campaigns is it's a very concerted, very deliberate effort to A, drive queer and trans people out of public space, and B, mobilize people on the basis of falsehoods so that conservative leaders can gain political power. It's a naked power grab. You know, this is a group that we can attack, that we can, you know, spread falsehoods about, and people will worry because people care about kids. So if you can spread misinformation and talk about how, you know, initiatives that are designed literally to support queer and trans kids and to, provide greater resilience. If you can convince people that they're taking innocent little straight and cisgender kids and turning them queer or turning them trans, people become quite frightened and alarmed. And unless we are successful in providing accurate information, this can create a viable platform for conservative candidates running for political office.
And when it comes to the protests and the concerns that some of the people involved raise, some of it is about parental involvement when it comes to what takes place in schools. Last week, Saskatchewan joined New Brunswick in adopting new policies around gender and pronouns that would require parental consent for students who wish to change their preferred names or pronouns. Angus Reid Foundation came out with a poll that found Canadians were divided on what level of parental involvement is necessary when it comes to children's preferred identification. What do you make of those concerns that it's about parents wanting to have a say or wanting information or involvement in their children's, in this case, pronouns?
I think in some cases, parents who do not want their children to be queer or trans don't want to see them supported. And they may not even know that their children are queer or trans, but, the family culture, perhaps the religious beliefs, etc., are anti-gay, anti-trans. So, if their kid is going to be out anywhere, it certainly isn't going to be at home. So for sure, it would be like, okay, we must limit the supports. We must limit the places where queer and trans kids and young people feel safe so that they, try to be straight. But, that's incredibly, incredibly harmful. And one of the things we know is that children are not always in safe environments. And for a queer or a trans kid, an environment where they feel unwelcome or that there's something wrong with them, it's incredibly damaging. And the onus is on us via public education context to try to provide safety for children. I mean, you could say that parents have the rights to teach their children to be racist and that it's not the school's business to counter that, but we wouldn't accept that for a second. But if parents are to have the right to teach their children that it's only okay to be heterosexual and that being trans is not a thing, that's not okay, that's equally problematic because there are queer and trans people everywhere. And one of the things we know is that the majority of trans kids are invisible because they know it's not safe to come out. But what I want to say about school contexts, I'm sure that if a teacher or counselor were to receive a disclosure from a kid that they are queer or trans or that they would like a different pronoun, probably one of the first questions that person would ask that kid is, hey, is this something you've talked with your parents about? And the kid would say, I haven't, I want to, but, I'm a bit nervous about that, but I'd like to. And I believe that teacher or that counselor would say, how can I help you? How can I support you, in coming to a place where you're ready to talk to your parents? Would you like me to be there? Those kinds of things. But in other cases, a kid would say, I would have to leave home if my parents knew. And a teacher or another adult at the school who it's their job to keep this kid safe and to support this kid, they need to respect confidentiality because it isn't safe. And kids know if it's safe for them to tell their parents. So do we just absolve ourselves as public educators from the responsibility of looking out for vulnerable kids and supporting kids so that they can be, prevented from living as they truly are, with the extensive research-based knowledge, as well as, the knowledge of so many people who have experienced it, that this has horrible outcomes for queer and trans people. The best thing that we can do for trans and gender diverse kids is to respect them when they tell us that, what their gender is and what pronouns they'd like, if they need to change their name. What we need to do is say, I'm here. Absolutely. Okay. Tell me how I can support you. That's what we need to do for queer and trans kids, not target them. And one of the things I would just like to add is that not these kinds of really public hate-filled campaigns, they don't just harm queer and trans kids. They harm, girls and boys who might be a little bit gender nonconforming, or who just, in some way feel like they don't fit with the dominant image of what boys are like or girls are like. It has a negative impact on all kids. It's very harmful.
Travers, it's very good to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michelle.
You take care. Travers is a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University and author of the book, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. An email now to BC Today from Meg. I would like to call in about this issue, but I'm too emotional. This protest affects me in a very personal way. I have a trans child and a non-binary child. They have both regularly experienced bullying and comments weekly, if not daily, to explain or, quote, defend their identities at school. Other students will look at them funny or misgender them on purpose. SOGI learning in schools at a young age is extremely important. Teaching kids how to respect others' personal expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation is extremely important. They are not teaching kids detailed information about the act of sex. They are teaching kids to be kind to others, tolerate difference, and be inclusive. Meg, thank you so much for your email. bctoday@cbc.ca. We're going to hear more about the rallies coming up in our next half hour, and we'll take your questions and calls as well about supporting people living with dementia. That's coming up after the CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. As we've been hearing on the show, rallies are being held across BC and the rest of the country to counter protests surrounding the teaching of gender and sexual diversity in schools. Clint Johnston, the president of the BC Teachers Federation, says much of the support for the original protests seem to be driven by disinformation and misinformation about what is happening in classrooms. North Vancouver RCMP are searching for the driver of a truck that hit the Main Street overpass on Highway 1 just north of the Ironworkers Bridge. Police say the driver fled the scene last night. Engineers say the overpass is structurally sound and the road reopened at about 3:30 this morning. And the North American Aerospace Defense Command says CF-18 Hornet fighter jets are conducting planned training today in airspace over southern BC, including Vancouver Island. NORAD says the aircraft are operating at a high altitude, but may be visible to the public. And now the forecast on the North Coast, mainly cloudy this afternoon with a high of 13. Highs up to 17 with some smoke and sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, clearing with a high of 14. Highs from 15 to 19 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, some sun and cloud with a high of 16 degrees. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, sunny this afternoon with highs up to 19. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
Thank you so much, Rob. That's Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC. We're on Radio 1, 88.1 FM in Metro Vancouver, live streaming on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. And as you have been hearing, there are protests across the province today and the country as well about schools including gender and sexual diversity in their curriculums. Similar events have been happening across Canada. Critics say these protests are driven by misinformation. And you've been hearing our guests and callers as well and emailers in our last half hour. And right now we have Anna joining us from Souk. Hi, Anna. Welcome to the show.
Oh, hi. How are you? How are you today?
I am fine, thank you. What are your thoughts today?
I just am thinking that I'm echoing what you were saying about how critics say there might be misinformation or just an absolute lack of knowledge what's happening in classrooms. I was there when our son had the 30-minute SOGI presentation 4 or 5 years ago. It's honestly the most simple, innocuous, gender affirming that some make different choices, and sexual identity affirming that there are some families who have 2 moms, some families who have 2 dads, some who have 1 mom, 1 dad, etc. I really think that the people that are protesting it honestly don't know what's going on in the classroom. And I'm actually concerned about some of the rhetoric that's going on about how they're sexualizing kids, and that there's many of the leaders, there's about 4 of them of this march, the 1 Million March for Children, have talked about how they're indoctrinating pedophilia and connecting to pedophile rings and things like that. And for myself, I'm 52, it echoes the satanic panic. And it's really concerning to me because it's based in absolute untruth. And, our son has several friends who have, over the last 4 or 5 years, begun their transition, changed their names. It's not a big deal. It's not a major part of our lives. We don't really talk about it. We support them. There's no agenda going on. We happen to be cisgender, my husband and I, and we understand that human beings are all on a spectrum. No one's completely straight, no one's completely gay. And we just really want to support and let everyone know out there that we are with you, because there are many of us that are silent, that couldn't be there today at the protest. I'm at work, calling from work right now. And the majority has spoken when the BC School of Trustees elections happened last year. This is not okay to be excluding people, and we're not going to stand for it.
Anna, thank you very much for the call from Souk.
Okay, have a great day.
You too. Anna calling us from work in Souk, and CBC reporter Joel Ballard joins us now from the Vancouver Art Gallery, where a counter-protest is taking place. And Joel, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Michelle.
Can you describe the scene around you right now?
Yeah, so, Robson Square in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery here is absolutely packed to the brim. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And, it's sort of best to describe it. It's sort of split off into 2 separate groups. So in front of the art gallery, we have hundreds of people celebrating trans rights, standing up for LGBTQ plus rights. And then at the end of the square, there's almost another confrontation happening between people who support trans rights. And then in the middle, there's a line of police. And on the other side of the police, there's people who are against SOGI being taught in schools, who have sort of really sparked this counter rally today.
What are you hearing from people about why they wanted to hold this rally for LGBTQ plus rights?
Right. So what's happening across BC and Canada today is there are about 80 different protests and rallies against SOGI being taught in public schools. And so this counter rally really grew out of knowing that there was going to be such big protests against trans rights and LGBTQ plus rights and SOGI being taught in schools. So this is a counter rally to really stand up in solidarity with trans people and with people of the LGBTQ plus community.
Joel, yesterday Mayor Ken Sim in Vancouver issued a statement saying, "Today we are being confronted by ignorance and bigotry, and we must always call it out and stand with those who are impacted. We can never allow ourselves to let hate win the day." So to all 2S LGBTQI plus individuals, know this: we see you and we value you. That is a statement from Vancouver Mayor Ken Sim. What is the response today from the city or police, if you are seeing them today?
Well, we're hearing a lot of the same things echoed from city leaders and officials. We even heard from Premier Eby, who echoed a lot of those same sentiments, that everyone, regardless of their sexual or their sexual orientation or their gender identity, deserves to feel safe, deserves to have their human rights protected and respected.
Joel, thank you very much, and we'll continue to follow this throughout the day. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Michelle.
That's CBC reporter Joel Ballard. And yes, do stay tuned to CBC for much more coverage of this throughout the day. It's 12:40 now, 1:40 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, tomorrow is World Alzheimer's Day. More than 500,000 Canadians live with some form of dementia. And this month, a BC group is launching a new guide, a kind of tool to empower people living with dementia and advocate for change in their community. They're called the Flipping Stigma Action Group, and we're going to be joined by the co-leaders in just a moment. We're also taking your calls. How can we empower and support people living with dementia? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 or email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. And I have two guests here with me in studio. Alison Finney is a professor at the UBC School of Nursing and co-director of the Center for Research on Personhood in Dementia. And Jim Mann is a community advocate who has been living with dementia for 17 years. They are the co-leaders of the action group behind this new toolkit. Alison and Jim, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, it's very good to have you with us. And can you tell me how this action group came about, Alison?
Well, a number of years ago, we applied for funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and we wanted to do research with people with dementia, so we invited them to join us. And it really took on a life of its own. It's become a much more powerful thing than I ever thought it would be possible.
How many people became involved?
I don't know, Jim. I think over the last number of years, it's been maybe 10 to 11 people. People have come and gone. I think we're a group of about 6 or 7 today.
And Jim, for yourself, why did you feel it was important to become involved?
Well, I was fortunate enough to join Alison and the other co-leader of the project, Dr. Deb O'Connor, in formulating the application for funding. And in working out some of the details, it became I realized how important the project would be. My mother had Alzheimer's, and so I saw the stigma and reactions, and with my own diagnosis, there is a need for a group of individuals with dementia to get together and move forward, and they worked on the toolkit and then ultimately the guide.
And you said that you observed how the stigma affected your mother and yourself as well. As far as you're comfortable, can you tell us about that, what you have faced?
Well, I guess for me personally, I've been somewhat fortunate in that I've been way too outspoken about my diagnosis. So a lot of people are told before there was any thought of this, of reacting in the stigma sort of way. But I certainly saw it with my mother in independent living, how she would sit with the other 3 people every day for the meals. And then one day I went on my way back home from downtown and went over, and there were 4 people at the table, and one of them was not my mother. And so where is she? And they pointed to the table in the corner and said, oh, she's over there. And so I guess they got tired of the stories, the same stories or the same questions or whatever it was. And so, viewing it through others' eyes and through others' experiences, there's certainly the realization that there is a real need to address it.
What is the impact of that stigma on people?
I think it's enormous. The example.
Jim is sighing there, yeah.
Yeah. I think Jim's story is one very good example. I think it forces people to to withdraw. They lose social connections. They lose friends. They're no longer listened to. People in our action group have talked a lot about their frustration in going to see the doctor, and the doctor no longer talks to them, but talks to a family member. Not being taken seriously, not being believed that maybe you have dementia. I could go on. Should I go on?
Well, Jim, I mean, you were shaking
powerful.
your head there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because people will feel it's demeaning to sit in a room, perhaps with other family members, and have everybody talk around you as if you're not there. And that's the part. And you know, there's a story I've often told in presentations about a fellow longtime member of a golf club. People would go to him for rules, for help with anything around the club. He would organize men's night, and the day after they heard about his diagnosis, no one went to him about a rule. And they immediately said, "Oh, don't worry. We'll look after men's night." Wow. As if in 12 hours, 24 hours, he went from being totally capable to totally incapable.
And I'll ask you about how to empower people then in the face of that in a moment. My guests are Alison Finney, professor at the UBC School of Nursing and co-director of the Center for Research on Personhood in Dementia. Jim Mann is a community advocate who has been living with dementia for 17 years. They're co-leaders of this action group, and this action group has put together a Flipping Stigma toolkit to empower people living with dementia and to be able to make change in their community as well. We want to ask you, how can we empower people who are living with dementia, and how can we support them too? If you're someone who is living with dementia, what is it that you would like to see? What impact does stigma have on you? And how do we change that? What would you like to see? Love to hear from you. 1-800-825, you can hear Jim reacting there. 1-800-8, you said you were outspoken. Our phone number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 as well. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. And so what is in this toolkit? You know, I went through it and read some of the stories of the participants as well. But what can people learn as to advocacy, self-advocacy, and self-empowerment? Yeah, Jim.
I think they will learn that once a person is diagnosed, life goes on. Reading the toolkit information and viewing the videos, they will hear the frustration from the action group members, but they will also hear what is possible. They will also realize that there's a group of people who all have dementia, and over Zoom, because I would venture to say 85% of the meetings were over Zoom because of COVID, et cetera. And so this group of people put together a toolkit over Zoom that is online. I was part of the research team. I've done this, not necessarily over Zoom, but I found it frustrating to try to visualize the toolkit from what we were talking about on Zoom,
right,
and visualize what it would look like on a computer screen, and so they were an effective group, but you know, they, as part of the whole project, they created a T-shirt. They said, you know, there's a sense of optimism. And so they created a T-shirt with a student from Emily Carr University, and along the T-shirt, the tagline, if you will, was dementia ... celebrate life.
Wow.
And so
That
I think
optimism.
that's the primary message.
Okay. What are the tools that are most important that you've heard?
The tools in the toolkit?
Yeah.
I think one of the most powerful things have been the video clips that you've talked about. This was not top-down work with experts identifying answers, but rather the powerful thing are these stories that have been told by the people themselves about the challenges they've faced and how they're pushing back.
Right.
And when you go to the website, you hear those voices in conversation. You see some videos. You hear people telling the stories about how they have become aware of the possibilities that exist in their life moving forward to live a good life.
It's that visibility, isn't it?
Absolutely.
With a T-shirt as well that you were talking about, Jim. Let's take a call now. Michelle is joining us from Salt Spring Island as we ask you, how can we empower and support people living with dementia? Michelle, welcome to the show. Hi, Michelle. Oh, I think we have lost our connection with Michelle. I apologize for that. Michelle, if you want to give us a call back, it's 1-800-825-5950, toll free. And Michelle was talking about working with seniors and what she's observed there as well. We'd love to hear from you, Michelle, if you please would give us a call back. And so we've been talking about the tools that have been important. As I understand it as well, the toolkit has been used in workshops at care homes and community centers and neighborhood houses. What is being taught to supporters and caregivers?
I think one of the things we've heard from caregivers, from people living in the community who really, we see the need, we want to help, but people aren't confident. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're not sure how to talk to someone with dementia. And this toolkit, I think, goes a long way toward relieving some of that anxiety and allowing people, I think, to have empathy, to kind of put themselves in someone's shoes, imagine what it would be like if it would be me, and how would I want to be approached.
Yeah.
So I think it's been quite powerful in that way. I think we've seen people become much more confident to take that step.
Okay, relieving that anxiety. What should people know when working with a person living with dementia? Or interacting and having those conversations. You said earlier that the friends that your mother had got tired, perhaps, and what Michelle was going to say was alluding to patience as well. So what should people know? What are the things that we should incorporate?
They're human.
Yeah.
Really, at the end of the day, you get the diagnosis and you don't go immediately to long-term care. There is a journey involved. Some journeys are longer than others, but there is still a journey. And during that journey, people, you can approach a person, you can talk to that person. You may well, be asked the same question again or repeat yourself. But you go with it.
And that's okay.
And you can encourage the storytelling. You can encourage and engage. And you will be surprised at the capabilities and the ability to carry on a conversation and the desire to carry on that conversation.
That empathy, once again.
Yeah.
We have Steve joining us from the Okanagan now. And Steve, what's your experience?
I'm a caregiver living with my wife who has early onset Alzheimer's. One thing, I've just recently been introduced to the Flipping Stigma project, and I've seen the shirt, and it looks great. But what I like about it is that whenever, we see a commercial or a fundraiser or something like that on TV, we always get kind of depressed after seeing it because, it kind of shows older folks and, losing touch with their family, and it's kind of a sad moment for us. And with what I've seen with the Flipping Stigma project, there's a lot of positivity to it, which is encouraging for me. Whether I can get my wife to kind of, and I'm not too familiar with the tools as of yet. I do want to do some more reading there, but for me, I guess it would just help us with more of a positive outlook, more tools to kind of use to kind of, keep the dementia in the back of our minds. It's not at the forefront,
Yeah. Steve, what a great point. Thank you so much for the call. All the best to you and your wife, okay?
Thanks.
Thank you. And this is something that you've been talking about. And it's interesting because you've been commenting, Jim, on the footage that you're seeing that we're airing as well, which is, this is us putting together what's out there, which is the usual image of really a lot of care involved, which is part of the journey. But it is a journey, as you said.
It's stereotypical. And
I'm learning, yeah.
That everybody is frail, is elderly. Usually they're unable to communicate. And that's the stereotypical model that we see in newspapers and so on.
But that needs to be addressed as well when it comes to the environment and inclusivity, does it not, Alison?
To be able to
With the population that does need more care.
It is true. But it is also true, I'm talking more and more with my students about dementia is a chronic disease. People live with this for a very long time. And as Jim said, we have tended what we imagine, and then what Steve talked about, we imagine people who are at the end of that journey. And certainly care is really important. We need to do a much, much better at creating good supportive care environments. But this work is really also about turning our attention to the communities, to our families, our neighbors, and recognizing we need to do community differently as well, because people are living long, good lives in community, and it needs to be much better so that people are more included.
I look forward to seeing the T-shirt. It sounds wonderful.
We should have worn them.
That's right. Really good to have you both. And where can they see this resource?
So the website is flippingstigma.com.
Flippingstigma.com. So good to meet you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alison Finney is a professor at the UBC School of Nursing and co-director of the Center for Research on Personhood in Dementia. Jim Mann is a community advocate who has been living with dementia for 17 years. Again, it's flippingstigma.com. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thank you so much for listening to the program and watching us as well on our live stream. Thanks to everyone who called in. Really appreciated hearing your stories today. You can listen again on the CBC Listen app and watch us on demand on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. We'll talk tomorrow.